Hey, thanks for clicking. I'm Grace, and this is where I share any opinions I might have about any of the literature I might read. And today, we're doing somewhat of a On This Day in History type segment because we are talking about Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. And it was first published on October 15th, which is hopefully when you're watching this video. October 15th in 1952. This book has a reading level of somewhere between second and third grade, and it fits into the genres of children's literature, novel, and fiction. And Charlotte's Web, I feel like, is one of those books that is almost 100% universally known. Like, I'm sure there's people who've never heard of it, but also, like, it is one of those foundational pieces of, well, at least my generation's, like, children's childhood literature. And I do have some thoughts and opinions about it. Now, look, okay, I'm not coming for your childhood. I'm not coming for your favorite cozy childhood novel. That's not what I'm doing here. And I'm still trying to figure out how to put this into words. If you don't know by now, I grew up very sheltered. I was very limited in what I was allowed to read, what I was allowed to explore. And so classic literature that I was exposed to is very different than the general public. And the things that occupied that slot for me, I've had to go back and re-examine and realize that listening to or reading those, I didn't read a lot of what people consider like the childhood classics because for one reason or another, my parents felt like they were not a good option for me. And I doubt that Charlotte's Web would have been on the no-no list, but I don't ever remember actually reading it. It's possible I did, but I don't remember it. I do remember the movie, so I'm sure I could have read the book if I wanted to. Not really the point. Just like everyone else, I had things, pieces of literature or media that meant a lot to me, that occupied that same slot that the classics do for people who weren't as sheltered as I am or was. And as I've gotten older, I've gone back to revisit those like cozy, comfy, familiar vibes, only to find out that those were just straight up indoctrination. And unfortunately, I can no longer look as fondly on those things as I used to. So all of that is to say that I have a general suspicion of anything that's the classics, you know? I think the classics served and still serve a certain purpose, but I also think that we should revisit the classics every once in a while with suspicion or caution, or looking kind of on the lookout for things that maybe don't align with our ideals any longer. And just to reiterate, my purpose with this channel is not to deem a piece of literature as good or bad, right? I've said it, I'll say it again. I don't think there is such a thing as a bad book or bad literature. I'm of the opinion that you're just not the right audience. So I'm bringing you this little book review of what I think a lot of people would consider a childhood classic, not to tell you what to do. I am simply providing my thoughts and opinions and asking if maybe we should adjust our perspective on a childhood classic. So, with all of those things in mind, let's get into it. Just in case this video has made it to someone who is unfamiliar with Charlotte's Web, I will give a brief summary, and then I want to kind of pick out some of the scenes that stood out to me and talk a little bit more about why. As the book starts, we meet Fern. She's a young girl. She lives on like a farm with her family, and there's a pig that gave birth to a litter of piglets, but one of the piglets is a runt, and so the dad is going to put the piglet out of its misery. Fern finds out about this and puts a stop to it. And the father says, fine, I will leave the pig as it is, but you have to take care of it. That way you can feel the weight of responsibility of this runty little pig. She does just that, and he is a healthy little piglet. They do everything together for quite some time, and then it ends up that he has to move to a different farm. So she sells him to her uncle because he has a little bit more room. He can keep the pig, and she can go visit the pig anytime she wants. And of course, she named him Wilbur. So kind of our two main characters are Fern and Wilbur. Wilbur grows up, he's getting bigger. There's kind of this talk around the farm that as he gets bigger, then there's going to come a time where they, butcher him and eat him. And as Wilbur is realizing that this is a thing that happens, he meets Charlotte. Charlotte is a spider that lives in his pen, and she decides she likes Wilbur and that she likes him so much that she's going to save him. She ends up devising a plan where she makes these really intricate webs that say things about the pig, and the people on the farm and in town decide that it's a miracle. He garners a lot of attention, and because of this, he ends up going to the fair. At the fair, he wins a prize, and everybody loves him so much, so his life is saved. It's at this point that we start to realize that Charlotte is nearing the end of her life. She's, lived a long, full spider life, and she makes her little egg sac, lays her eggs, and that's really all she has strength to do. And so Wilbur is kind of like mourning her loss, but he decides to take her egg sac with him home, where he puts it somewhere safe, and then the babies hatch, and most of them leave the nest, but a couple stay after. And so then there's this really sweet ending of just like those spiders stay and they're his friends and they have their little babies, and then a couple stay every time that the new set hatch, and so he has friends for the rest of his life. So overall, it's this really sweet story of a girl and her piglet, and friendships, and kind of the realities of life and death. There's a lot of kind of underlying messages that I think make it through this story to the reader. So something that I want to get a little bit nitpicky about is some of the attitudes towards and around children. In this first chapter alone, we see several statements that I think kids could hear and take them a certain way. There's this moment where Fern realizes that her dad is going to, put the pig out of its misery, and she doesn't understand why. She's very upset by it, and she's expressing that. She's just expressing how upset she is, that it feels very unjust that this little piggy has to die just because he's a little smaller than the rest. And her father's response to this is, control yourself. And, I think the greater message there is that, your emotions are too much. Please hide those. And as someone who came from a family where that sentiment was often portrayed, to experience that sort of thing at home, right? And then see that sort of thing in a book, that would just be reinforcement that my environment is how everybody's environment is, And so I don't like it. I know this was written in the 50s, so it's very likely that this was just the normal existence of a family. But I think it sends a bad message to kids. I do. And then, just a few minutes later in that same chapter, we hear the father has decided he is going to let the pig live, and he's brought it inside for Fern to take care of. And he says something to the effect of, may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness. And again, I think it's just that message to kids that, like, Fern being concerned or compassionate, right? Like, she has this innate sense of compassion for this living creature. And it's so strong and so deeply held that she's unwilling to allow her father to do this thing. And it's clear, like, with that statement, to me, that says that her dad thinks that this is stupid, right? Like, he thinks this is ridiculous. Her behavior is ridiculous. I mean, he's already told her that she needs to control herself, hide her emotions, and it just feels like a reiteration of this is dumb. Now, throughout this story, the father, like through the rest of the story, the father is a much more compassionate and understanding person to his daughter. It's just this first scene, really, where I felt maybe personally attacked, in that, like, here's this young girl, she's having these big emotions, and she's being a little bit put down for having big emotions and for what the big emotions are about, And so I think for a child in a healthy environment where their needs are being met, this sort of thing probably isn't going to bother them or, like, send a bad message. But I do think that this, personally, I didn't like it. Something else I noticed in this first scene that really jumped out at me is the portrayal of the brother, Avery. He's just such a boy, Like, he comes in with, like, a wooden knife and a toy gun, and he wants a pig, and, like, he's just always, like, running around in the woods. He's always got, like, bugs or frogs with him. And just that really stark difference of the treatment between Avery and Fern stood out to me as well. Again, as somewhat of a product of its time, for sure. Something to, I don't know, think about. Again, this is something that I will admit is pretty nitpicky, but I'm just saying that Wilbur is kind of dumb. Like, just his thought processes are kind of dumb, and I think that's rude to pigs, because pigs are super freaking smart, and Wilbur is giving them a bad name. So E.B. White, you should have a better opinion of pigs. Just saying. One thing that I loved throughout the whole book was just how cozy and comforting he depicted the farm and just kind of, like, life in general. The way that he describes these scenes of nature and how everybody goes about life is just so, so cozy. And God, I loved it. It was like, oh man, I want to be there. And, like, I know it's not as nice as he's, like, painting this picture right now, but damn, that sounds nice. So something interesting I noticed about the writing, to start off the book, we start from, like, the human perspective, and it's kind of third person. We're not really, like, we're hearing about people's thoughts, but we're not hearing them, like, it's not POV, right? Like, we're not hearing them think the thoughts. We're just hearing that they thought that. And it's very human based, right? And we meet the pig, and then around chapter 3, there's kind of this transition that you start to notice where you start to hear Wilbur's internal monologue, and just kind of, like, it's just kind of him by himself. Like, he's not really interacting with anybody else's thought process. It's just him. And honestly, chapter 3, like, made me so sad. because he's so bored, he's so sad and like despondent. And I was like, this guy needs some enrichment in his pen. And chapter 3 is titled Escape. So, like, he tries out escaping. It's kind of funny, like, it's way too much work, and so he like follows the food home because he's like, I'm exhausted, this is not fun, escaping is not for me. But then we see we see kind of another transition between, it's just his internal monologue to now he's actually like having conversations out loud with the other animals, you know, across, like, he's having conversations with the geese, and then he's having conversations with the sheep, and then, you know, so on and so forth. And so I was probably about halfway through the book when I like realized, wait a second, that was a super smooth transition between like, we're just hearing human stuff, human thoughts, and then we're hearing Wilbur's thoughts, and like, when did it change? Like, just the seamless transition between, you know, between like reality, this is the kind of communication that we're all comfortable with, and then now the animals are talking, you know? Yeah, I just thought that his transition between those two realities was done super well. I really enjoyed that too. There's a couple of sections throughout the book where we get some like really detailed information about spiders. And like there's one section where he like breaks down all of the segments of a spider's leg. And I was like, wow, like, okay, this is educational. So that was another little piece that I enjoyed. I don't know why this tickled me, but there's this part of the book where the I think it's the sheep are telling Wilbur that there's like this conspiracy against him, that the farmer is planning to, you know, do what you do to pigs. And Wilbur had no idea about this. And the sheep just comes in and he's like, oh yeah, they're all plotting against you. And Wilbur's like, what? And he's like, yeah, even Fern's dad. And he's like, not Fern's dad. Like, he's just so flabbergasted. And it just, I don't know why, that was so funny to me that like, I've been around people who have a farm, and yeah, that's just the conversation you have. Like, oh yeah, we're waiting for him to get about this big, or, you know, when this time comes around, then that's when we'll, you know, butcher this animal or whatever. And like, it's not, they're not trying to hide it. It's not this secret, but just the way that it's portrayed from the animal's point of view as like this conspiracy that everybody's plotting that they're gonna eat Wilbur. I don't know, something about that was just comical to me. There's another moment where Fern, so it's kind of Fern's habits where she like just comes and sits in like the barn or near the pig pen, and she just sits there quietly. It says, like, every time that they reference Fern, she's just sitting on a stool, just kind of like hanging out in the middle of the area, but she's like listening, and she can hear what they're all saying. And so she ends up taking that home and telling her, like, oh, well, did you guess what so-and-so said? And she's telling her parents about all the things that the animals were talking about. And so this is one of those moments where you see her dad be compassionate, unlike that, like, first scene. Because the mom is like, I'm really worried about Fern. Like, the animals are talking to her. Like, should we be concerned? And the dad's like, nah, I don't know. He's like, in some ways, he's like, I don't know. I mean, they could be talking to us, and maybe we're just not listening. And like, and the mom's like, what? Like, I just imagine that meme from the Bee Movie, you know, where he's like, what? And so the mom becomes like so concerned about this that she goes to the family doctor, and she's like, look, this is what's going on. And it gets even better because the doctor's like, well, who knows? They could be talking to us. Maybe we're just not listening. And this is probably one of my favorite like literary depictions of a doctor, because he's just like he's just like, well, you know, kids. And he even says, pulled out a quote of like, maybe our ears aren't as sharp as Fern's. And just like not invalidating Fern's experience as a child. And he's like, you know, is she eating well? Is she sleeping well? You know, I don't think we have to be concerned about her. And he basically is like, you know, I don't think you have anything to worry about. I think she'll grow out of it. And in fact, the mom is like, is she just gonna sit in that barn for the rest of her life? And he's like, nah, she'll find something else to be interested in later. And even he's like, is she friends with any boys? Which was interesting to me because as I was reading that, it seemed almost like an encouragement to the mother to maybe like encourage her to have interest in boys, which, coming from the circle that I come from, like, who is giving that advice? You know? But I just thought that was an interesting perspective to find in the middle of this book. Oh, so this is another one that kind of made me chuckle. So Charlotte is making these webs, right? The first one says some pig because that's what the farmer always says about Wilbur. He calls him some pig. And so she's trying to find better words to put up. And she's really trying to steer clear of words that would remind someone of food. And so the rat suggests to her to use the word crunchy. And she says, no, we don't want the farmer to think about crisp, crunchy bacon, right? And so then he brings her back. The rat brings up the word radiant, but it's from like a soap box. And she's like, well, what does radiant mean? And he's like, I don't know. And the quote is something like Charlotte had never used soap flakes or something like that. And I was like, okay, but had she eaten bacon? Like, so she didn't know what radiant meant because she had never used soap flakes, but she's had crispy bacon. I've got some questions, Charlotte. I've got some questions. So the copy that I was able to listen to of this book actually had an afterword that was written about E.B. White's life. But they had some interesting details that pertain to the book and some of his other writings. And there was kind of a summer location where he spent a lot of time, which it was the basis for a lot of the descriptions he included in this book. So I thought that was kind of a nice, he was writing about his childhood through writing this book, which makes sense why it feels so cozy. Like, it does feel like someone who really experienced these things as a child and the wonder of it and just kind of like the carefree nature of some of it. But there's a section in there that talks about kind of how he wrote, and like it even talks about like, oh, this was his first draft of the first chapter, and then this was his second draft of the second chapter. So I thought that was interesting to kind of see the process that he went through as a writer to come to this. And they even talk about the very end, which I think is kind of the main theme of the story, is that we see Charlotte's life come to an end, right? And he talks about how like the first time he wrote through it, that chapter that's about her death was originally titled something like Charlotte Dies or Charlotte's Death or something like that. And then he eventually changed it to The Last Day. And that is the portion of the book that made me tear up because it's so like, on her last day, this is what was going on. And like the world was just carrying on in spite of the fact that Wilbur was losing his best friend, you know, and like there's this grief happening and there's this life ending all alone by herself, and the world just carries on, you know, like nothing happened. And they talked about how, and E.B. White talked about how he didn't want that to be the ending of the book, because the book isn't about Charlotte dying. It's about how life is born out of the death of other things, you know? And so, like, you know, that's just the natural life cycle of spiders, is they make their little egg sac and then they die. All those little eggs turn into spiders and they do the same thing, right? And over and over and over again. And so the last chapter is actually, let me look it up, a warm wind, because you know, the warm wind is what carries the little baby spiders on their webs out into their life. And I really appreciate that about this story. On the one hand, Fern's compassion speaks to me on a personal level of, you know, I don't want this little piglet to die unnecessarily. You know, he could live, so why wouldn't we put the effort into making sure he can? And yet, death is still just an unavoidable fact of life. And it's a necessary part of life, right? Which we're not going to get into the whole existential crisis of that, but you get what I'm saying. And to be able to wrap that idea up in this cute, heartwarming kids story, that's some talent. I mean, really, that's some talent as a writer, to be able to communicate those kinds of ideas in a way that a child can understand. So, if it's been a while since you've read this book, or you're looking for maybe a cozy read to start with your child, I do recommend this. I have my I have my little picky things about it. There's a couple things that I kind of frowned at, but overall, I do think that this is a cute, cozy book. I think it has some really good and helpful messages, and yeah, I mean, I think it'll continue to be a classic. I mean, like I just said, when you cover death in a way that is digestible for children, it's kind of necessary. And that's kind of all I got for you today. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Have you read a kid's book that covers this topic of death better? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. And if you would, give this video a like, maybe subscribe, and I hope to see you around.